The blood-soaked letter trembled in Margaret Nichols' hands as she collapsed to her knees in the dusty doorway of her homestead. The terrible news from the doctor in Denver, confirming what she had feared most after her recent miscarriage: she would never carry another child. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Montana Territory in the summer of 1878, painting the rugged landscape in hues of amber and gold that mocked the darkness spreading through her heart. Maggie. Virgil Quinn's deep voice broke through her grief as his tall figure appeared on the horizon, returning from a long day of tending cattle on his neighboring ranch. The sight of her crumpled form sent him running, spurs jingling with each hurried step, the worry on his weathered face deepening the lines etched by years under the western sun. Margaret quickly folded the letter and tucked it into her apron pocket, but not before Virgil caught a glimpse of the doctor's seal. At 32, he had known Margaret since she arrived in Elk Valley 3 years prior, a young widow of 26 seeking a fresh start after losing her husband and infant daughter to influenza back east. Though they had begun as merely neighbors helping one another survive the harsh frontier, something deeper had grown between them, something neither had yet found the courage to name. "It's nothing," she lied, brushing dust from her skirt as she rose to her feet. "Just a letter from back home." Virgil's green eyes, sharp enough to spot a stray calf from a mile away, saw through her deception immediately. "Your folks been gone 5 years now, Maggie. Who'd be writing from Philadelphia?" She turned away, unable to face the concern in his expression. The evening breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and pine, a cruel reminder of all the beauty that remained in a world suddenly emptied of hope. "The doctor," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "From Denver." Virgil removed his worn Stetson, holding it against his chest as he approached her cautiously, as one might a spooked horse. "About the baby you lost last winter," Margaret nodded, tears finally spilling down her sun-freckled cheeks. He says I can't have children. Ever." The words burned her throat like whiskey. "The fever damaged something inside. There won't be any more chances." The silence between them stretched as long as the Montana sky. Virgil had known how desperately she wanted a family after losing everything. When her brief courtship with the blacksmith's son had ended in a hasty wedding, and then a tragic miscarriage months later, Virgil had been the one to find her husband drunk and despondent at the saloon before he rode off, never to return. "Come inside," Virgil finally said, gently guiding her by the elbow. "I'll make some coffee." Margaret allowed herself to be led into her modest cabin, sinking into a chair at the rough-hewn table while Virgil moved about her kitchen with the ease of familiarity. His broad shoulders and capable hands had helped raise this very roof 2 summers ago when a windstorm had taken half of it away. "You know," he began, his back to her as he stoked the cook stove, "my ma used to say there's more than one way to make a family." Margaret stared at his silhouette, outlined by the amber glow of the fire. "What good is a woman who can't give a man children?" Virgil turned, his expression suddenly fierce. "Is that what you think your worth is? Breeding stock?" She flinched at his harshness, but he continued more gently, moving to kneel before her. "Maggie, listen to me. You're the woman who nursed half the town through smallpox last year without catching it yourself. You're the one who teaches the homesteaders' children their letters even though the schoolhouse is just a dream. You're the finest shot with a rifle in 3 counties, and you make pie crust so flaky it nearly floats off the plate." A reluctant smile tugged at her lips despite her misery. "Virgil Quinn, are you saying you only befriended me for my apple pie?" "Wouldn't be the worst reason," he replied with a wink, relief softening his features as he saw her smile. He reached for her hand, his calloused palm rough against her skin. But no, I'm saying that having babies isn't the only thing that makes a woman valuable, not by a long shot. Margaret pulled her hand away, suddenly uncomfortable with his nearness and the sincerity in his gaze. It's different for men. You don't understand what it feels like to have your body betray you. Virgil rose and returned to the stove, pouring the boiling coffee into 2 chipped mugs. Maybe not, but I do know what it's like to want something so badly it hurts to breathe without it. The way he said it made Margaret look up sharply, but Virgil's expression had closed off, hidden behind the steam rising from the coffee he handed her. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her fingers around the warm mug. "For the coffee and for being here." "Where else would I be?" he asked simply. The question hung in the air between them as night settled fully over the valley. Through the open window, coyotes began their mournful song, echoing the ache in Margaret's heart. Days stretched into weeks as Margaret withdrew into herself, moving through her chores like a ghost. The letter remained tucked in her Bible, its cruel certainty a weight she carried everywhere. Virgil visited daily, bringing fresh game or vegetables from his garden, fixing loose boards on her porch, or simply sitting in companionable silence as they watched the sunset paint the mountains. One evening in late August, as Margaret hung laundry on the line, the distant sound of hoofbeats made her pause. Riders approached not just Virgil's familiar gait, but a group moving fast. She reached for the rifle she kept propped against the porch post, a precaution born of frontier wisdom. 5 men appeared over the rise, dust billowing behind them. At their center rode Sheriff Peterson from town, his badge catching the sunlight. Relief flooded Margaret as she recognized them as neighbors rather than the bandits who occasionally plagued the territory, and she lowered her weapon. "Mrs. Nichols," the sheriff called, tipping his hat as the men reined to a stop. "Afternoon to you. Don't mean to trouble you, but we've got a situation." "What kind of situation, Sheriff?" Margaret asked, shielding her eyes from the setting sun. "Bank robbery over in Gunnison. 3 men heading this way." He gestured toward the mountains. "They split up. Posse is tracking the others, but one's wounded and leaving a blood trail leading right toward your property." Margaret's stomach tightened with dread. "Virgil's out checking his north pasture. He doesn't know." "Thompson here is riding to warn him," the sheriff said, nodding toward a young cowhand. "Rest of us are going to sweep the creek bed. Just wanted to warn you to lock your doors and keep that rifle handy." "I appreciate it," Margaret replied, her mind already racing ahead. "I'll be careful." As the riders departed, Margaret hurried inside, securing windows and doors. She moved efficiently, the widow's survival instincts kicking in. Loaded rifle in hand, she positioned herself by the window with a clear view of the approach to her cabin. Dusk settled over the land, painting shadows that seemed to move and shift in the fading light. Every rustle of leaves sent her heart racing. The minutes stretched into hours with no sign of Virgil or the wounded outlaw. Just after full dark, a noise at the back door made her freeze. Not a knock, but the soft scrape of something against wood. Margaret moved silently across the room, rifle raised. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Silence answered her, then a pained groan. Against her better judgment, Margaret peered through the small window beside the door. A figure slumped against her steps, barely visible in the darkness. "Help," came a weak voice. "Please." "Water." Margaret hesitated, Sheriff Peterson's warning echoing in her mind. But what if it was someone from town, or one of the homesteader's children lost after dark? "Show yourself," she demanded. "Move into the moonlight where I can see you." The figure shifted painfully, revealing a man clutching his side, dark liquid seeping between his fingers. Even in the dim light, she could see he was no local. His clothes were fine but filthy, his face obscured by several days' growth of beard. Just water, he pleaded. Then I'll go. Margaret kept her rifle trained on him as she considered her options. Christian charity demanded she help a wounded man. Frontier wisdom warned against trusting strangers, especially tonight. "Are you the man they're looking for?" she asked bluntly. "The bank robber." The man's laugh turned into a cough. "They say I took what wasn't mine." "I say the bank took it first." He shifted, revealing a blood-stained saddlebag beside him. "Does it matter? I'm dying anyway." "It matters," Margaret replied firmly. "I won't harbor a criminal." "Then shoot me and be done with it," he challenged, spreading his arms wide despite the obvious pain it caused him. "Be a mercy compared to bleeding out slow." Margaret's finger tensed on the trigger. She had killed before game for food, a rabid wolf threatening her chickens but never a man. Yet as she looked at him, she saw not a hardened criminal but a frightened young man not much older than the blacksmith's son she had briefly married. "I'll give you water," she finally said, "and bandages for your wound. Then you have to leave." Relief washed over his features. "Thank you, madam." Margaret filled a canteen and gathered clean rags, then cracked the door open just wide enough to push them through, keeping her rifle ready. "The bandages go inside the wound," she instructed. "Pack it tight to stop the bleeding." The man nodded gratefully, drinking deeply before attempting to tend his injury. His clumsy efforts and paling face told Margaret he was losing too much blood too quickly. "You need proper doctoring," she said reluctantly. "Can't risk it," he mumbled, eyes growing unfocused. "They'll hang me sure." Before Margaret could respond, another sound caught her attention, the familiar rhythm of Virgil's horse approaching at a gallop. The wounded man heard it too, panic flashing across his face as he struggled to rise. "That'll be my neighbor," Margaret told him. "He won't take kindly to finding you here. Please," the outlaw begged, desperation making him young again. "I have a wife, a baby coming. I just wanted to give them a better life." Margaret's heart twisted painfully at the mention of a child. "You should have thought of that before turning to crime." "Margaret," Virgil's voice called from the front of the cabin. "You all right in there?" "Sheriff said there's trouble." The outlaw lunged for his gun, but Margaret was faster, bringing her rifle butt down hard on his wrist. "Don't," she warned, her voice steel. "I won't let you hurt him." Confusion crossed the young man's face. "You're protecting him. After I told you about my family, I'm protecting both of you," Margaret clarified as Virgil's footsteps circled the cabin. "From doing something neither of you can take back." She raised her voice. "Back here, Virgil, and come slow, I've got a situation." Virgil appeared around the corner, his own rifle ready, eyes widening at the scene before him. "Maggie, get away from him. He's wounded, Virgil. Badly." She didn't lower her weapon but stepped slightly between the two men. "He says he has a wife and baby on the way." Virgil's expression hardened. "And a posse wanting to string him up for shooting the bank teller in Gunnison. That poor man might lose his arm if he survives at all." The outlaw's face crumpled. "It was an accident. The gun just went off when he grabbed for it." "Seems accidents follow you like flies on honey," Virgil said coldly, moving closer. "Sheriff's about 10 minutes behind me, Maggie. Step aside." Margaret didn't move. "What will happen to him?" Virgil's eyes never left the wounded man. "Justice will happen." "And his family? What justice for them, losing a husband and father?" Something flickered across Virgil's face, understanding, perhaps, of what truly troubled her. "That's not on you, Maggie. His choices brought him here." "Everyone deserves mercy," she insisted. "Even sinners." Virgil studied her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. 5 minutes, he finally said. "Then I signal the sheriff." He lowered his rifle slightly. "What's your name, boy?" The outlaw swallowed hard. James Harker." "Well, James Harker, seems you've got one chance to do right by your family before you hang. Where's the money you stole?" James glanced at his saddlebag. All there. Didn't spend a cent. Virgil nodded to Margaret, who cautiously retrieved the bag while keeping her rifle trained on the outlaw. Inside, bundles of cash lay beside a small daguerreotype of a pretty young woman. "Your wife?" Margaret asked softly. James nodded, tears filling his eyes. "Sarah, she's due in November. Her pa disowned her for marrying me. We've been living in a tent outside Golden." His voice broke. "I just wanted enough to buy her a proper house before winter." Margaret felt her own eyes burning. A baby coming in November when the Colorado mountains would already be deep in snow. A young mother without family or proper shelter. "Give it back," she said suddenly, looking up at Virgil. "All of it. Let him turn himself in. If he returns the money voluntarily, he still shot a man," Virgil reminded her gently. "Accidentally," she insisted. "There's a difference between a mistake and malice." Virgil crouched down to look James in the eye. "Is she telling the truth?" "Was it really an accident? I swear on my unborn child," James whispered. "I never meant to hurt anyone." Something in his desperation must have convinced Virgil, for he stood with a heavy sigh. "The posse is coming whether we signal or not, but I know the judge in Gunnison. If you surrender peaceful and the money's returned intact, he might show leniency." Hope flickered across James's pale face. "You'd speak for me." "I'll speak for the truth, whatever it is," Virgil said firmly. "That's all any man can ask." The sound of approaching horses ended their conversation. James slumped in defeat, looking younger than ever. "My Sarah," he said brokenly. "She won't survive winter alone." Margaret and Virgil exchanged looks, some unspoken understanding passing between them. "Where is she?" Margaret asked. "Exactly." "Small camp by Clear Creek, just outside Golden," James replied. "Look for a blue patchwork quilt hanging on the tent. It was her grandmother's." Margaret nodded once, decision made. "I'll find her." "Maggie," Virgil started, but she cut him off. "I'm going, Virgil, with or without your help." Before he could argue further, Sheriff Peterson rounded the corner with 2 deputies, rifles raised. "Well now," the sheriff said, taking in the scene. "Seems you've saved us a chase, Mrs. Nichols." As the lawman took James into custody, Margaret pulled Virgil aside, speaking urgently. "I mean it. I'm going to find Sarah." Virgil studied her face, reading the determination there. "Why? This isn't your burden to carry." "Because I know what it's like to face the world alone," she answered simply. "And because that baby deserves a chance." Understanding dawned in Virgil's eyes. "You're thinking of taking them in?" "Just until James's case is settled," Margaret said, though they both heard the hesitation in her voice. "She needs somewhere safe to have her baby." Virgil removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's a 2-week journey to Golden and back, assuming good weather. You can't go alone." "I've traveled alone before." "Not through Ute territory with winter coming on," he countered. "Not with outlaw gangs still roaming those parts." Margaret crossed her arms stubbornly. "I'm going, Virgil." He replaced his hat with a resigned shake of his head. "Then I'm going with you." The sheriff approached before Margaret could respond, leading a handcuffed James toward his horse. "We're obliged for your help catching this one," he said. "Saved us a lot of trouble." "Sheriff," Virgil said, "what's likely to happen to him in Gunnison?" Peterson frowned. "Hard to say. Bank teller's still alive and the money's recovered, but shooting a man serious business, accident or not. And if someone spoke for him, a character witness." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "You volunteering, Quinn? Didn't know you were acquainted with our outlaw friend here." "I'm not," Virgil admitted, "but I believe in a man facing fair judgment for his actions." Sheriff Peterson shrugged. "Trial's set for next month." "You're welcome to say your piece, though I can't promise it'll make much difference." As the lawmen prepared to depart with their prisoner, Margaret approached James one last time. "I'll find her," she promised quietly. Your Sarah will be cared for, whatever happens." Gratitude and grief warred on James's face. "Thank you," he whispered. Tell her I'm sorry and that I love her more than my own life." Margaret nodded, throat tight as the posse rode away, the young outlaw's shoulders slumped in defeat. "You're really set on this, aren't you?" Virgil asked when they were alone again. "I have to do this," Margaret replied, gazing at the mountain silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "For her, for the baby." She paused, voice softening. "For me." Virgil stepped closer, his expression solemn in the moonlight. "Then we leave at first light. Pack only what you need, we'll travel fast." As Margaret turned to go inside, he caught her hand, his touch sending warmth up her arm despite the cool night air. "Maggie," he said softly, "are you sure about this? Taking in a stranger, maybe raising someone else's child. It won't be easy." Margaret looked down at their joined hands, then back up to meet his concerned gaze. "Nothing worth doing ever is, Virgil." The journey to Golden proved arduous but uneventful. September brought shifting weather to the mountains, with mornings crisp enough to see their breath and afternoons warm enough to make the horses sweat. They rode from dawn until dusk, making camp beside streams where Virgil would catch fish for their supper while Margaret prepared a fire. They spoke little during the long days in the saddle, each lost in private thoughts, but the silences between them were comfortable, the ease of two people who understood each other without words. At night, sitting across the campfire, they would sometimes share stories of their pasts, filling in the gaps of knowledge that neighbors might never otherwise learn. Margaret told him about her brief, happy marriage to her childhood sweetheart, cut short by influenza that claimed both husband and infant daughter within a week of each other. Virgil spoke of his time scouting for the army during the last of the Indian Wars, the things he had seen that made him choose a solitary life afterward. "Is that why you never married?" Margaret asked one night as they watched sparks float upward to join the stars. "Because of what happened during the wars." Virgil poked at the fire with a stick, his face half hidden in shadow. "Partly. Didn't seem right to bring a wife into a world I couldn't make sense of myself." He glanced up at her. "And then, after I figured some things out, the only woman I wanted wasn't available." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "And now?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. Virgil held her gaze steadily across the flames. "Now I'm helping that woman find a stranger's wife and unborn child, because that's what matters to her." His smile was gentle. "And because that's the kind of woman she is, the kind who carries other people's burdens as if they're her own." Margaret looked away first, overwhelmed by the tenderness in his expression. "We should get some rest," she said, retreating to her bedroll. "Long day tomorrow." But sleep came slowly as she replayed his words in her mind, wondering at their meaning and at the strange fluttering in her chest whenever he looked at her that way. They reached Golden 10 days after setting out from Elk Valley, a bustling town nestled where the plains met the mountains. The search for Sarah Harker proved simpler than they had feared, asking at the general store about a young woman living in a tent with a blue patchwork quilt led them directly to the small camp by Clear Creek. Sarah Harker was perhaps 19, with golden hair and a delicate face currently swollen from weeping. Her condition was obvious, her rounded belly straining against a dress that had clearly fit better months ago. When Margaret and Virgil approached her campsite, she clutched a kitchen knife defensively until Margaret explained who they were. "James sent you?" Sarah asked incredulously, lowering the knife. "My James is alive." "Yes," Margaret confirmed gently. "He's in custody in Gunnison. He asked us to find you." Sarah's face crumpled, relief and fear battling as she sank onto a camp stool. "They said on the posters he shot a man. My James wouldn't do such a thing." It was an accident, Virgil explained, remaining a respectful distance away while Margaret sat beside the young woman. The teller grabbed for the gun during the robbery and it went off. He robbed a bank, Sarah whispered, as though saying it aloud made the incomprehensible real. My husband robbed a bank. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she placed protective hands over her belly. What am I going to do? My family disowned me when I married him. I have nowhere to go, no money. That's why we're here, Margaret said, covering one of Sarah's trembling hands with her own. James asked us to look after you. Sarah looked up in confusion. But you don't even know me. I know your husband loves you enough to face his punishment honorably, knowing you'll be safe, Margaret replied. And I know what it's like to face the world alone when you're meant to be facing it with someone you love. We've come to bring you back to Elk Valley, Virgil added. Mrs. Nichols has offered you a place to stay until your baby comes and your husband's situation is resolved. Sarah looked between them, bewilderment giving way to cautious hope. Why would you do this for strangers? Margaret smiled gently. Because no one should have to bear their burdens alone. That evening, as they helped Sarah pack her meager possessions for the journey, Margaret found herself examining the blue patchwork quilt that had identified the camp. Intricate stitches joined dozens of fabric squares in a pattern that told the story of a family wedding dates and births embroidered in delicate thread, names and places preserved in cloth. My grandmother made it, Sarah explained, noticing Margaret's interest. She started it on her wedding day and added to it with each important family event. My mother continued the tradition, and now it's mine. She ran her fingers over a square where the stitching was clearly newer. This one is for my wedding to James. And this, she touched an unfinished square, is waiting for our baby's name and birth date. Margaret traced the loving stitches, thinking of all the history captured in this single piece of handiwork. It's beautiful, she said softly. A tangible reminder that we're all connected to those who came before us. It's silly, Sarah said with embarrassment, but sometimes I talk to them, the grandmothers and great-aunts whose names are sewn here. I ask them for strength when things get hard. That's not silly at all, Margaret assured her. We carry the love of those who came before us, even when they're gone. That night, as Sarah slept in the tent and Virgil kept watch outside, Margaret lay awake thinking about legacies and connections. For 3 years, she had lived with her grief as a solitary burden, believing that the death of her child had severed her from the chain of life that connected all women through the generations. But perhaps there were other ways to be part of that lineage through compassion, through choosing to help rather than turn away. The journey back to Elk Valley was necessarily slower with Sarah's condition. They purchased a small wagon in Golden, making a bed of blankets in the back where the young woman could rest when the jolting motion became too much for her. Virgil drove the wagon while Margaret rode alongside, the three of them forming an unlikely caravan as they made their way eastward through the mountain passes. Sarah proved to be good company despite her circumstances, her youth and natural optimism rising above her worries. She told stories of growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a prosperous merchant who had disowned her for eloping with James, a clerk in her father's store deemed unsuitable because of his humble origins. Father said James would never amount to anything, Sarah confided as they sat around the campfire one evening. I think that's why James was so desperate to prove him wrong, to show he could provide for me properly. A man wants to feel worthy of the woman he loves, Virgil said quietly, gazing into the flames. Sometimes we do foolish things trying to prove ourselves. Margaret glanced at him sharply, but Virgil kept his eyes on the fire, lost in thoughts he didn't share. As they traveled, the relationship between the three travelers shifted and grew. Sarah, initially shy and uncertain, blossomed under Margaret's maternal care. Virgil, always respectful, became almost brotherly with the young woman, teaching her to fish in the streams they camped beside and carving a small wooden horse for her unborn child. Margaret found herself watching Virgil in these moments, seeing a gentleness in him she had only glimpsed before. The way he helped Sarah down from the wagon, his big hands careful and steady. How he told stories that made her laugh despite her worries. The wooden toys taking shape beneath his knife each evening by the fire. "He would have made a wonderful father," Sarah commented one afternoon as they watched Virgil fishing upstream. "Do you think he regrets never having children?" The question caught Margaret off guard. I don't know. We've never discussed it." Sarah gave her a sidelong glance. "He cares for you a great deal. Anyone can see it." Heat rose to Margaret's cheeks. "We're neighbors, friends." "Friends," Sarah repeated with a knowing smile that made her seem older than her years. "If you say so." Before Margaret could respond, Virgil returned with several trout for their supper, ending the conversation but not the thoughts it had stirred. That night, after Sarah had retired to the wagon, Margaret found Virgil sitting some distance from the camp, staring up at the vast canopy of stars. Without a word, she settled beside him on the fallen log he had chosen as his perch. "She's a good girl," Virgil said after a while. "Brave. Reminds me a bit of you when you first came to Elk Valley." Margaret smiled at the memory. "I was terrified, not brave. Everything I owned in one trunk, and no idea how to survive a Montana winter." "Yet here you are," Virgil replied, his voice warm with admiration. "Not just surviving, but helping others survive too." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, listening to the night sounds of the forest, an owl's distant call, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the gentle murmur of the stream where they had caught their dinner. "What Sarah said today," Margaret began hesitantly. "About you being good with children. Have you ever regretted not having a family of your own?" Virgil considered the question, his profile strong against the starlit sky. "There was a time when I thought I would. Before the war, I had it all planned out, a ranch of my own, a wife, half a dozen children running wild on the prairie." His voice softened with remembered dreams. "But after, things changed. I changed." "Because of what you saw?" Margaret asked gently. "Because of what I did," he corrected, turning to face her fully. "I followed orders that I knew in my heart were wrong. I watched women and children suffer and told myself it wasn't my place to question why." His hands clenched into fists on his knees. "After that, I didn't think I deserved the kind of happiness other men take for granted." Margaret covered one of his fists with her hand, feeling the tension in his fingers. "And now," Virgil looked down at their joined hands, then slowly unfurled his fingers to intertwine with hers. "Now I think that maybe redemption is possible. That perhaps doing right today matters more than the wrongs of yesterday." His gaze lifted to hers, so intense that Margaret found herself unable to look away. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of feeling too powerful to be denied yet too fragile to be acknowledged. "We should get some rest," Virgil finally said, his voice rougher than usual. "Still a long way to Elk Valley." As he helped her to her feet, his hand lingered in hers a moment longer than necessary. Margaret returned to her bedroll that night with her heart beating strangely fast, like a bird testing its wings after a long winter. They reached Elk Valley, 17 days after leaving, the first snowflakes of the season swirling around them as they crested the final ridge, overlooking the small collection of homesteads and ranches that made up their community. Margaret's cabin stood as she had left it, smoke rising from the chimney, a sign that someone, likely Virgil's ranch hand, had prepared for their return by starting a fire to warm the cold rooms. "Home," Margaret said with relief, pointing it out to Sarah. "It's not much, but it's sturdy and warm." "It's wonderful," Sarah replied sincerely, her eyes bright with tears. "I can't thank you enough for bringing me here." The next weeks established a new rhythm to Margaret's life. Sarah settled into the small bedroom that had once been intended for the children Margaret had hoped to have. The two women fell easily into a domestic partnership, Sarah proving herself handy with a needle and quick to learn the skills needed for frontier survival. Virgil visited daily, as he had before their journey, but now there was an underlying current to their interactions, a tension born of shared experiences and unspoken feelings. He brought supplies, helped with heavier chores, and spent hours talking with Sarah about her husband's case, which he would testify at when the trial began the following month. October painted the valley in russets and golds as Sarah's time grew nearer. Her belly swelled prominently now, the baby active enough that sometimes Margaret could see the outline of a foot or hand pressing against the taut skin. Each such moment brought a bittersweet pang joy for Sarah mixed with renewed grief for Margaret's own lost chances at motherhood. "Have you thought of names?" Margaret asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Sarah knitting tiny garments while Margaret mended a tear in Virgil's shirt that he had left behind on his last visit. "James Jr. if it's a boy," Sarah replied, smiling down at her work. "For a girl." She hesitated, then looked up shyly. "I was thinking, Margaret, if that wouldn't be too presumptuous." Emotion closed Margaret's throat, making speech impossible for a moment. "I would be honored," she finally managed to say. "But surely there's a family name you'd prefer." "Someone from your own kin." Sarah shook her head firmly. "You are my family now, you and Mr. Quinn. When everyone else in the world had turned their backs, you came for me." Her hand stilled on her knitting. "That means more than blood." Before Margaret could respond, a sharp knock at the door startled them both. Virgil stood on the porch, snow dusting his broad shoulders, his expression grave. "Telegram from Gunnison," he said without preamble, holding out a folded paper. "The trial's been moved up. Judge wants me there in 3 days." Margaret's heart sank as she read the brief message. "So soon? But that means you'll be gone when?" "When the baby comes," Virgil finished, glancing at Sarah's rounded form. "I know, but if I don't go, James faces the court without anyone to speak for him." Sarah pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes wide with fear. "You have to go," she insisted, though her voice trembled. "James needs you more than we do." "I'll leave at first light," Virgil decided. "If I ride hard, I can make it in time." That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Virgil lingered by the door, reluctant to leave despite the late hour and the snow falling more heavily outside. "I don't like leaving you two alone," he admitted. "Not with Sarah so close to her time." "We'll manage," Margaret assured him, though her own anxiety fluttered in her chest. "Mrs. Borgstrom from the Peterson place is coming to stay once Sarah's labor begins, and Dr. Simmons promised to come as soon as we send word." Virgil nodded, but his brow remained furrowed with concern. "I should be here." "You should be where you're needed most," Margaret countered gently. "Right now, that's in Gunnison, speaking for a young man who made a terrible mistake." Virgil reached out suddenly, capturing her hand in both of his. "Maggie," he began, then faltered. "I've been wanting to say. That is, I've been meaning to tell you." Margaret's heart quickened at the intensity in his gaze. "Yes, just be careful," he finished lamely, releasing her hand. "Send word to town if there's any trouble. The sheriff promised to check on you every few days." Disappointment trickled through Margaret's veins like snowmelt. "We'll be fine, Virgil. You focus on helping James." He nodded, settling his hat firmly on his head before stepping out into the swirling snow. Margaret watched from the window as his tall figure disappeared into the white darkness, a strange emptiness opening inside her at his departure. 2 days after Virgil's departure, Sarah's labor began. The first pains struck just after breakfast, mild enough that Sarah insisted on finishing the dishes before admitting she needed to lie down. Margaret sent her young neighbor Tommy Peterson racing to fetch his mother and the doctor, then set about preparing the cabin for the birth. By midday, Sarah's pains had increased significantly, coming at regular intervals that left her gasping. Mrs. Borgstrom arrived with her basket of herbs and birthing linens, her experienced hands checking Sarah's progress with efficient movements. "First babies often take their time," she reassured both women. "But everything feels right. The little one is in position and ready to meet the world." As afternoon faded to evening, Sarah's labor intensified. Margaret held her hand through each contraction, wiping her brow with cool cloths and offering sips of water between pains. Outside, the snow continued to fall, piling against the windows and muffling the world beyond the cabin's walls. "The doctor should have been here by now, Mrs. Borgstrom muttered, peering anxiously out the window at the deteriorating weather. "This storm's worse than they predicted." "Will she be all right?" Margaret asked quietly while Sarah dozed between contractions. The older woman's face was grave. "The baby's coming regardless of weather or doctors. We'll do our best, as women have always done." As darkness fell completely, Sarah's labor entered its final, most demanding phase. Her cries echoed through the small cabin as she pushed with each contraction, her face flushed with effort and pain. "I can't," she sobbed after a particularly grueling effort. "I can't do it anymore." "You can," Margaret encouraged, supporting her shoulders. "You're the strongest woman I know, Sarah Harker. Your baby is counting on you. James should be here," Sarah wept. "What if he never sees our child?" "He will," Margaret promised, though she had no way of knowing if it was true. "You have to believe that." With renewed determination, Sarah bore down again, a primal scream tearing from her throat as the baby's head finally emerged into Mrs. Borgstrom's waiting hands. "One more push, child," the midwife urged. "Just one more and you'll meet your little one." With a final, tremendous effort, Sarah delivered her baby into the world, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and lungs strong enough to make his displeasure known immediately. "A son, Mrs. Borgstrom announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean cloth. "Perfect in every way." Tears streamed down Sarah's exhausted face as her son was placed in her arms. "James," she whispered, tracing his tiny features with a trembling finger. "My little James." Margaret stood back, her own cheeks wet as she watched mother and child together. The love illuminating Sarah's face was transcendent, a holy thing that made the small bedroom seem suddenly sacred space. Later, with Sarah and baby James sleeping peacefully and Mrs. Borgstrom dozing in the rocking chair, Margaret slipped outside onto the porch. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed into a crystalline wonderland beneath a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. In the profound silence of the snow-covered valley, Margaret allowed her tears to fall freely, tears of joy for the miracle she had witnessed, tears of grief for her own lost child, tears of something unnamed that ached in her chest when she thought of Virgil facing a different kind of storm in Gunnison. "Please keep him safe," she whispered to the stars, not certain who she was asking or what exactly she was asking for. The next days passed in a blur of newborn care and recovery. Baby James proved to be a vigorous infant with a healthy appetite and powerful lungs that announced his needs to the entire household. Sarah, though exhausted, blossomed into motherhood with natural grace, her love for her son evident in every tender touch and soft-sung lullaby. A week after the birth, with still no word from Gunnison, Sheriff Peterson arrived at the cabin door, his expression somber as he removed his hat. "Mrs. Nichols," he began, "I've news from the trial." Margaret's heart stuttered in her chest as she ushered him inside, where Sarah sat nursing her son by the fire. The young mother's face drained of color at the sight of the sheriff, her arms tightening protectively around her baby. "Is it James?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Is he?" "Your husband is alive, Mrs. Harker," the sheriff assured her quickly. "The trial concluded yesterday." "And," Margaret prompted when he hesitated. "5 years at the territorial prison," Sheriff Peterson said gently. Judge took into account his voluntary surrender, the return of the money, and the testimony of Mr. Quinn regarding the accidental nature of the shooting. Sarah's sob was a mixture of relief and despair. 5 years, she repeated brokenly. "My James will miss our son's first steps, his first words." "It could have been much worse," the sheriff reminded her. "The prosecutor was asking for 15 years, or even hanging since a man was shot." Mr. Quinn's testimony made all the difference, convinced the judge it truly was an accident and that your husband was remorseful. "When will Virgil return?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with the urgency in her voice. "That's the other thing I came to tell you," Sheriff Peterson replied, his expression growing troubled. "There was some trouble after the trial. Some of the bank teller's family didn't agree with the sentence, thought it too lenient. Words were exchanged, then fists." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Quinn took a bad blow to the head defending your husband from the teller's brother. Dr. Gunnison says he needs rest before traveling." Margaret's knees weakened and she sank into a chair. "How bad is it?" "The telegram didn't say, just that he's staying at the hotel there until he's fit to ride." The sheriff reached into his coat, extracting a folded paper. "He sent this for you, Mrs. Nichols." Margaret took the telegram with trembling fingers, reading Virgil's brief message. "All well. Harker sentence fair. Slight delay in return. Don't worry. VQ." "Slight delay," she repeated, anger flaring suddenly. "A head injury serious enough to prevent travel is not a slight delay." "That's Virgil for you," Sheriff Peterson said with a fond shake of his head. "Man could lose an arm and call it a scratch if he thought it would spare others worry." After the sheriff departed, Sarah and Margaret sat in silence, each absorbing the news in her own way. The baby slept peacefully against his mother's breast, unaware of the adult concerns swirling around him. 5 years, Sarah finally said, her voice steadier now. "It's not forever." "No," Margaret agreed gently. "And you'll be here safe and cared for until he returns." Sarah looked up, her young face showing wisdom beyond her years. "You care for him very much, don't you, Mr. Quinn?" Margaret busied herself with the mending in her lap, avoiding Sarah's perceptive gaze. "He's my friend." "More than that, I think," Sarah persisted. "I've seen how you look at him when you think no one notices." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. "It doesn't matter. Virgil has never indicated he wants anything more than friendship." Sarah laughed softly, startling her. "Oh, Margaret, for someone so wise in so many ways, you can be remarkably blind." She shifted baby James to her shoulder, patting his back gently. "That man loves you with his whole heart. Anyone with eyes can see it." "You're imagining things," Margaret protested, though her pulse quickened at the words. "Am I?" Sarah challenged. "Who rides 5 miles through snow just to bring you coffee beans because you mentioned running low? Who built that hen house without being asked because you said gathering eggs in winter was hard on your hands? Who looks at you like you hung the moon and stars personally?" "That's just Virgil," Margaret said weakly. "He's kind to everyone." "Not like he is with you," Sarah insisted. "And if you're honest with yourself, you'll admit you feel the same way about him." Margaret set aside her mending, suddenly unable to focus on the small stitches. Did she love Virgil Quinn? The question echoed in her mind, demanding an answer she had been avoiding for months, perhaps years. She thought of his steady presence in her life since her arrival in Elk Valley. How he had helped her learn to survive the harsh Montana winters, teaching her to chop wood properly and preserve game. The way he always seemed to know when she needed company and when she needed solitude. The strength in his hands and the gentleness in his eyes. "Even if I did," Margaret finally said, "what could come of it? I can't give him children. No man wants a barren wife." Sarah's expression softened with compassion. "Is that what's been holding you back? Fear that he wouldn't want you because you can't bear children?" When Margaret didn't answer, Sarah continued, "Not all men measure a woman's worth by her ability to produce heirs. Some understand that love is about far more than that. It's different for a man like Virgil," Margaret argued. "He should have sons to inherit his ranch, to carry on his name." "Why not let him decide what he wants?" Sarah suggested gently. Rather than making the choice for him, the question lingered in Margaret's mind long after Sarah and the baby had gone to bed. She sat alone by the dying fire, turning over the possibilities in her heart like stones in a stream, examining each facet in the flickering light. 2 weeks passed with no further word from Gunnison. The initial fear for Virgil's safety gradually gave way to a dull anxiety that colored Margaret's days as she went about caring for Sarah and baby James. November settled fully over the valley, bringing shorter days and longer nights filled with frost-bright stars. Sarah recovered her strength quickly, soon able to take on household tasks while caring for her son. The young mother's resilience impressed Margaret, who found herself growing more attached to both mother and child with each passing day. "I've been thinking," Sarah said one morning as they worked together kneading bread dough, baby James sleeping in a basket nearby, "about what happens when my James is released." Margaret paused, flour dusting her forearms. "That's still years away." "Yes, but I need to plan for our future," Sarah replied with practical wisdom. "I can't impose on your hospitality forever." "You're not imposing," Margaret assured her quickly. "Having you and the baby here has been a blessing." Sarah smiled, her hands never stopping their rhythmic work on the dough. "Even so, I should contribute more. I was thinking perhaps I could take in sewing. I'm quite skilled with a needle, and there are plenty of folks in the valley who could use a seamstress." "That's a wonderful idea," Margaret agreed. "We could clear space in the front room for a sewing table by the window." Their domestic planning was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, moving to the window with her heart suddenly racing. A rider appeared over the rise, and even at a distance, she would know that straight-backed silhouette anywhere. "Virgil," she breathed, relief flooding through her. Without pausing to grab a shawl against the November chill, Margaret rushed out onto the porch. Virgil's horse trotted into the yard, steam rising from its flanks in the cold air. As he dismounted, Margaret could see a healing cut above his right eye, the skin around it still faintly yellowed with a fading bruise. "Maggie," he said simply, his voice carrying a warmth that belied the frosty air between them. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around his solid frame and assure herself he was truly all right. Instead, she stood frozen on the porch steps, suddenly shy in the face of feelings she had only recently acknowledged to herself. "You're late," she said, trying to sound stern but failing as her voice caught on the words. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Had a slight delay." "A head injury is not a slight delay, Virgil Quinn," she scolded, finding her voice at last. "You might have sent more detailed word." "We were worried sick." Virgil climbed the steps to stand before her, close enough that she could smell the familiar scents of leather and wood smoke that clung to him. "We?" he asked softly. "Sarah and I," Margaret clarified, though her racing heart suggested other concerns. "And how is your head?" "That cut looks deep." "Looks worse than it is," he assured her. "Doctor says I'll live, though I might be a touch more hard-headed than before." "As if that were possible," Margaret retorted, relieved enough now to allow her exasperation full voice. "Come inside before you freeze. Sarah will want to hear about the trial, and there's someone you should meet." Virgil followed her into the warm kitchen, where Sarah stood with baby James now awake in her arms. The young mother's face lit with joy at the sight of him. "Mr. Quinn, thank God you're safe. We've been so worried." "Mrs. Harker," he greeted her with a tip of his hat before his gaze fell on the infant in her arms. His expression softened instantly. "And this must be young James. Would you like to hold him?" Sarah offered, already moving forward. To Margaret's surprise, Virgil nodded, setting aside his hat before accepting the bundled baby with unexpected confidence. His large hands cradled the infant with gentle care, one finger tracing the tiny features with wonder. "He has his father's chin," Virgil observed quietly. "Strong, determined." "How is James?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Truly, the sheriff told us about the sentence, but nothing of his condition." Virgil looked up from the baby, his expression grave but kind. "He's well, all things considered. Worried about you and the boy, but relieved the sentence wasn't worse." He shifted James more securely in his arms. "He asked me to tell you he loves you both more than his own life, and that he'll spend every day of his sentence becoming a man worthy of your weight." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but she nodded bravely. 5 years will pass. We'll be here when he's released." Virgil asked, glancing between the two women. "Margaret has offered to let us stay," Sarah explained. "I'll be taking in sewing to contribute to the household." A strange expression crossed Virgil's face, relief mixed with something more complex. "That's good," he said carefully. "This valley's a fine place to raise a child." The 3 adults settled into comfortable conversation around the kitchen table, sharing a meal while baby James dozed in a makeshift cradle nearby. Virgil recounted the details of the trial, the judge's reasoning for the sentence, and his own injury defending James from the angry relatives of the wounded bank teller. "Foolish risk," Margaret chided when he described stepping between James and a man wielding a chair leg as a club. "You might have been killed. Wouldn't have been right to let him be beaten after facing his justice honorably," Virgil replied simply. As evening approached, Sarah excused herself to put the baby down for the night, leaving Margaret and Virgil alone by the fire. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the distant lullaby Sarah sang to her son. "You look tired," Margaret finally observed, studying the new lines around Virgil's eyes. "The journey must have been difficult with your injury." "Worth it to get home," he replied, his gaze holding her steadily across the hearth. "Home." The word hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. This wasn't Virgil's home. His ranch lay 5 miles to the north, yet something in the way he said it made Margaret's heart flutter strangely. "I should go," Virgil said eventually, rising to his feet with obvious reluctance. "My foreman's been handling things alone too long already." "Yes, of course," Margaret agreed, standing as well. "You must be anxious to get back." Virgil reached for his hat, turning it slowly in his hands rather than putting it on. "Actually," he began, then stopped, seeming to search for words. "Actually, I was hoping we might talk. Tomorrow, perhaps, if you can spare the time." "Talk," Margaret echoed, her mouth suddenly dry. "About what?" "About the future," Virgil replied, his voice deepening. "Yours and mine, if you're willing." Before Margaret could respond, he settled his hat on his head and moved toward the door. "I'll come by midday," he said. "Get some rest, Maggie. You look like you haven't slept properly since I left." And then he was gone, leaving Margaret standing by the fire with her heart thundering in her chest and Sarah's knowing smile visible from the bedroom doorway. The next day dawned clear and cold, sunlight glinting off frost-covered grass as Margaret moved through her morning chores with distracted efficiency. Sarah watched her with amusement, noting how she changed her dress twice and pinned and repinned her hair before noon approached. "You're making me dizzy with all this fussing," Sarah teased as Margaret checked her reflection in the small mirror for the third time. "He's seen you covered in flour and chicken feed. I doubt he'll notice if your hair is perfectly coiled." "This isn't about Virgil," Margaret protested weakly. "I always try to look presentable." "Of course," Sarah agreed with mock solemnity. "And I always sing lullabies to the chickens." Before Margaret could retort, a knock at the door announced Virgil's arrival. He stood on the porch holding the reins of two saddled horses, his own bay gelding and Margaret's dappled mare. "Thought we might ride," he suggested, nodding toward the horses. "There's something I'd like to show you." Curiosity overcoming her nervousness, Margaret fetched her coat and gloves. "Will you be all right?" she asked Sarah. "We won't be gone long." "We'll be fine," Sarah assured her, bouncing baby James gently in her arms. "Take your time." The air was bracing as they rode away from the cabin, following a trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen toward the foothills. Virgil led the way, occasionally glancing back to ensure Margaret was keeping pace. They rode in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts as their horses picked their way along the familiar path. After nearly an hour, they crested a ridge overlooking a small valley Margaret had never seen before. A creek meandered through meadowland bordered by thick forest, the whole scene nestled against the mountains like a jewel in a protective setting. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, reining her mare to a stop beside Virgil. "I didn't know this place existed." "Few do," Virgil replied, satisfaction evident in his voice. "It's part of my property, the northernmost section that backs up to government land." He dismounted, helping Margaret down from her horse before leading her to a flat rock overlooking the valley. They sat side by side, the winter sun warming their faces despite the chill in the air. "I bought this land 10 years ago," Virgil explained, gesturing toward the valley below. "Planned to build my home here someday when the time was right." "Why didn't you?" Margaret asked, pulling her coat tighter against a sudden breeze. Virgil's gaze remained fixed on the distant mountains. "Never seemed right somehow, building a house just for myself." He turned to face her then, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "A home should have a family to fill it. Without that, it's just walls and a roof." Margaret's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "And now, has something changed your mind about building?" "Not something," Virgil said quietly. "Someone." He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small wooden box that he placed in her gloved palm. With trembling fingers, Margaret opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," Virgil explained, his voice rough with emotion. "She made me promise to give it only to a woman with courage enough to face the frontier and heart enough to make it worth facing." Margaret stared at the ring, unable to speak past the lump forming in her throat. "I'm not a man of fancy words, Maggie," Virgil continued when she remained silent. "But I love you. Have done since that first winter when you insisted on chopping your own firewood even though the axe was near as tall as you." His smile was tender with the memory. "You're the strongest, most stubborn, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and I'd be honored to build a life with you. Right here in this valley." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Virgil," she began, her voice faltering, "you know I can't have children." The doctor was very clear about that. "I know," he replied simply. "And that doesn't matter to you," she pressed, needing to be certain. "Most men want sons to inherit their land, to carry on their name." Virgil took both her hands in his, ring box and all. "Maggie, listen to me carefully. I'm not asking you to give me children. I'm asking you to share my life." His grip tightened gently. "There are children in this world who need homes like young James, whose father will be absent for years. There are others in orphan trains and foundling homes who have no one at all. If God sees fit to bring such children into our lives, we'll welcome them. If not, your love is more than enough for me." A tear spilled down Margaret's cheek as the fears that had held her captive for so long began to loosen their grip. "But no buts," Virgil interrupted firmly. "I've made my choice, Maggie. The only question now is whether you want the same. And if I can never give you a family," she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Virgil's expression softened into a smile that made her heart turn over in her chest. "You can't carry a child again," he acknowledged gently. "Then carry my heart instead. It's been yours all along anyway." The simple truth of his words washed over Margaret like spring rain after a long drought, bringing life to places long barren. Without further hesitation, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, pouring years of unspoken longing into their first kiss. When they finally parted, both breathless, Virgil rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a hint of laughter in his voice. Margaret smiled through her tears. "Yes, Virgil Quinn. I will marry you and build a home in this valley and carry your heart as carefully as you've carried mine." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit over her glove. "I thought we might start building in the spring," he said, his practical nature reasserting itself now that the most important question had been settled. "Simple at first, 4 rooms with a good hearth. We can add on as needed." "As needed," Margaret repeated, raising an eyebrow. Virgil shrugged, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Who knows how many strays we might take in over the years? Already got one young mother and baby under your roof." "They're family now," Margaret said firmly. "Sarah and James both." "Our family," Virgil agreed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "The first of many connections we'll make together." They rode back to the cabin hand in hand, their horses ambling side by side along the trail. The winter sun hung low on the horizon by the time they reached the yard, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. Sarah met them at the door, one look at their joined hands and Margaret's glowing face telling her all she needed to know. "Well, it's about time," she said with mock exasperation. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the root cellar together." Virgil laughed, the sound rich and free in a way Margaret had never heard before. "Would have been a waste of good vegetables," he teased, helping Margaret remove her coat. "Besides, some things can't be rushed." That evening, the 3 adults sat around the fire planning a future none of them could have imagined months before. Virgil would begin gathering lumber for the new house as soon as weather permitted. The wedding would take place in the spring, a small affair in the meadow where their home would stand. "We'll have the house ready before James is released," Virgil promised Sarah. "A place for all of us with room to grow." "All of us," Sarah repeated, surprise evident in her voice. "You mean to include James and me in these plans?" "Of course," Margaret replied, exchanging a glance with Virgil. "You're family now." "The first additions to our household, but perhaps not the last." Sarah's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help design the kitchen," Virgil suggested practically. "Margaret says your biscuits are better than hers, and I aim to eat well in my old age." As laughter filled the small cabin, Margaret looked around at these people who had become her family through choice rather than blood. Virgil with his quiet strength, Sarah with her resilient grace, baby James sleeping peacefully in his cradle. The ache of what she had lost would always remain, a tender place in her heart, but it no longer defined her future. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, painting the valley in wildflowers and birdsong. The foundation of the new house took shape on the ridge overlooking the creek, its sturdy beams rising against the blue Montana sky. Friends and neighbors gathered for a raising, transforming Virgil's careful plans into walls and a roof in a single day of community effort. On a perfect morning in May, with the scent of pine and meadow grass in the air, Margaret Nichols became Margaret Quinn in a simple ceremony beside the half-built house that would become their home. Sarah stood as her witness, baby James in her arms, while the entire settlement of Elk Valley gathered to celebrate. "I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again," Margaret confessed that night as she and Virgil stood on the porch of her cabin, their temporary home, until the new house was completed. "After losing my first family, I believed that chapter of my life was closed forever." Virgil drew her into the circle of his arms, his wedding ring catching the moonlight as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Some stories have more than one chapter, Maggie. Ours is just beginning." As if to prove his point, a cry from inside the cabin announced that young James was awake and hungry. Margaret laughed softly, turning in the circle of her husband's embrace. "Duty calls," she said with a smile, "ready to be an honorary uncle." "Ready for all of it," Virgil replied, capturing her lips in a kiss that held both passion and promise. Every single day. 5 years later, the house on the ridge stood complete, its windows glowing with lamplight as evening settled over the valley. The main room buzzed with activity, as Margaret supervised the hanging of evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the Christmas celebrations. 3 children darted between the adults: 5-year-old James, solemn and helpful; 3-year-old Elizabeth, abandoned at the stage station as an infant and adopted by Margaret and Virgil; and 2-year-old Michael, orphaned in a diphtheria outbreak, and now the youngest Quinn. Outside, the sound of approaching horses brought everyone to the windows. 2 riders appeared on the trail, one familiar and one long-awaited. "They're here," James shouted, racing for the door. "Pa's home." Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands, her face alight with nervous joy. 5 years had matured her from a frightened girl into a confident woman, but in this moment, she looked as vulnerable as the day Margaret had first met her. "Go on," Margaret urged gently. "He's waited long enough." Sarah needed no further encouragement, hurrying outside despite the December chill. Margaret watched through the window as James Harker, released from prison just 2 days earlier, dismounted and stood uncertainly before his wife, 5 years of separation stretching between them like a vast plain. For a breathless moment, they simply looked at one another, Sarah taking in the lines of hardship etched on her husband's face, James marveling at the beauty of the woman who had waited faithfully for his return. Then, as if a dam had broken, they rushed together, clinging to each other with the desperation of drowning souls finding shore. Virgil dismounted more slowly, giving the reunited couple privacy as he led both horses toward the barn. His gaze met Margaret's through the window, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in that silent exchange. Later, with the children asleep and James Harker meeting his son properly for the first time in the private apartment Virgil had built for the young family, Margaret and Virgil sat alone by the fire. "They'll stay through winter," Virgil said, watching the flames dance across the logs. James has a job waiting in Denver come spring, honest work with Sarah's uncle's freight company. I'll miss them, Margaret admitted, nestling against her husband's solid warmth. Especially Sarah, she's been like a sister to me. They'll visit, Virgil assured her. And there's always room here if they need to return. Margaret nodded, her fingers absently tracing patterns on Virgil's palm. Our family keeps growing in unexpected ways. Speaking of which, Virgil said, his voice taking on a note of studied casualness that immediately caught her attention. Sheriff mentioned something interesting when I was in town yesterday. Seems there's a family that perished in that blizzard up north. Parents didn't make it, but 3 children survived. Margaret sat up straighter, recognizing the tone. In 5 years of marriage, she had come to know when her husband was circling around a subject close to his heart. 3 children. She repeated, already counting beds and considering arrangements. Ages 7, 5, and barely 1, Virgil confirmed. No relations willing to take them, sheriffs asking if anyone in the county might. He trailed off, watching her face. Might give them a home. Margaret finished for him, a slow smile spreading across her features. Well, we do have those 2 empty bedrooms since we added the east wing. Virgil's answering smile warmed her more thoroughly than the blazing fire. My thoughts exactly. Might be a bit chaotic for a while. When is it not? Margaret laughed, gesturing toward the scattered toys and small boots by the door. What's 3 more when we already have 6 children? Virgil mused, shaking his head in mock dismay. Whatever happened to that woman who feared she couldn't be a proper wife without bearing children? She married a man wise enough to show her that family isn't made from blood alone, Margaret replied softly, reaching up to trace the lines at the corners of his eyes, lines deepened by 5 years of laughter and shared joy. Virgil caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. No regrets? He asked, a rare moment of vulnerability in his steady gaze. Margaret thought of the path that had led them here, from grief to unexpected joy, from solitude to a house bursting with life and love. The inability to bear children, once a wound that seemed unendurable, had opened her heart to a different kind of motherhood, one no less profound, for being chosen rather than given. Not a single one, she answered truthfully, leaning forward to kiss him with all the love that had grown between them. Every child in this house carries a piece of my heart, just as I've carried yours all these years. Outside, snow began to fall gently across the valley, covering the land in pristine white, a blank page ready for new stories to be written. Inside the warm house on the ridge, a family created by choice rather than chance prepared for sleep, secure in the knowledge that love, in all its forms, was the strongest foundation any home could have.